Dear friends, don't miss future updates. Hit the subscribe button and help us reach our next milestone together. My name doesn't matter as much as the reason I'm finally telling this story out loud. For most of my life, I kept the truest parts of myself folded neatly inside a drawer that no one else was allowed to open, and I kept the key somewhere even I pretended not to know. If you had asked me at 12, at 17, at 25 whether I was hiding anything, I would have looked you in the eye and said no with the easy confidence of someone who has practiced the lie for so long that it feels like the truth. But there was always something underneath. A quiet pressure. A second heartbeat. A version of me who watched the world through my eyes and waited patiently for permission to breathe. I want to talk about crossdressing today, but not the way people usually talk about it. I don't want to shock anyone, and I'm not going to describe outfits or moments meant to entertain. What I want to share is the interior life of someone who spent decades trying to understand what they were feeling, why they were feeling it, and what it meant for the people they loved. I want to talk about the confusion of childhood, the fear of adolescence, the loneliness of young adulthood, the shame that followed me everywhere like a shadow with my own face, and the slow, imperfect process of learning to accept myself without hurting the people around me. If you have ever felt like there was a locked room inside you, I hope this helps. And if you have never felt that, I hope this helps too, because empathy is built out of stories we did not have to live ourselves. I was born into a family that loved me in the ways they knew how. My father worked long hours in a job that wore his hands down to calluses and his patience down to a thin, careful line. My mother stayed home with my younger sister and me until we started school, and then she took a job at a local clinic where she answered phones and filed papers and came home smelling faintly of antiseptic. We were not wealthy, but we were not struggling in the ways that make the news. We had a small house with a small yard, and in that yard there was a maple tree that turned the color of fire every autumn, and I remember lying under it as a child and feeling, even then, that something inside me did not match the shape of the world I had been placed in. I did not have words for it. I only knew that when my sister let me try on her plastic tiara for a joke one afternoon, I felt a warmth in my chest that I did not want to give back with the tiara. I laughed with her and handed it back and went outside to kick a ball around because that was what boys were supposed to do, and I already understood without anyone telling me that supposed to was a fence I was not allowed to climb. The first time I remember being genuinely afraid of myself was when I was 9. My mother had left a load of laundry on the bed to fold, and among the towels and my father's undershirts there was a soft blue sweater of hers, the kind with a wide neck and long sleeves that always fell past her wrists. She was in the kitchen. My sister was at a friend's house. My father was still at work. I stood in the doorway of my parents' bedroom, and I looked at that sweater for what felt like an hour, and I understood, in the way children understand things they cannot explain, that if I picked it up something inside me would change forever. I picked it up anyway. I pulled it over my head. It smelled like her perfume and like the fabric softener she used, and when I looked at myself in the mirror on the back of the closet door, I saw a child who looked almost the same as before, except the eyes were different. The eyes were relieved. I took the sweater off within 30 seconds because I heard my mother's footsteps in the hall, and I folded it back exactly the way I had found it, and I walked out of that room and never told anyone what had happened. But I carried it with me. I have carried it with me every day since. For years after that, I tried to convince myself it had meant nothing. Children try on things. Children are curious. Children touch the world with their hands because that is how they learn what the world is made of. But the feeling did not go away. It grew quietly, the way ivy grows on a wall you have stopped looking at. In middle school, I started noticing that when my sister and her friends talked about clothes, I paid a kind of attention that my male classmates did not. I noticed fabrics. I noticed the way a certain color could change the mood of a room. I noticed that when I was alone in the house and no one was expected home for hours, I would drift without deciding to toward my sister's closet, and I would stand in front of it and argue with myself and lose the argument and then win it and then lose it again. I want to be honest about this next part because I think honesty is the only reason to tell a story like this at all. There were times as a teenager when I did put on my sister's clothes when no one was home. I did not do it often, and I did not do it for anyone else, and I never took anything that would be missed. I did not damage anything. I did not steal. But I understand now, looking back, that even careful borrowing was still a violation of her privacy, and it is one of the quiet regrets I carry. She did not know. She could not consent. And even though nothing I did harmed her materially, I have come to believe that the people we love deserve to know the shape of the space we occupy in their lives. I have since apologized to her, years later, in a conversation I will describe when we get there. I bring it up now because I do not want to romanticize what I did as a scared kid. I want to name it clearly. I was hiding, and part of my hiding involved someone else without her knowledge, and that is a form of harm even when the intent is only survival. What I felt in those moments was not what people who have never experienced this often assume. It was not thrill. It was not performance. It was a kind of stillness. For a few minutes, the low hum of wrongness that lived at the base of my skull would quiet, and I would sit on the edge of my sister's bed with my hands in my lap and just breathe, and the breathing would feel like breathing for the first time all week. Then I would take everything off, put it back exactly, wash my hands as if I had done something dirty, and return to being the boy everyone expected me to be. The boy who played on the school soccer team not because he loved it but because his father needed him to. The boy who laughed at the jokes the other boys made about girls, even when the jokes made his stomach turn. The boy who dated a very kind girl named Rachel for 8 months in high school and broke up with her not because he did not care about her, but because he could feel her getting close enough to see through him, and he was not ready to be seen. High school was the loneliest chapter, and I think it is important to say that, because I know there are young people watching this who are in that chapter right now and who believe that the way they feel is the way they will always feel. It is not. But when you are 17 and you cannot tell anyone what is happening inside you, the walls of your own skull can feel like the walls of a prison. I spent a lot of that time on the internet, late at night, with the brightness on my monitor turned down so low that anyone walking by would not have been able to see the screen. I read forums. I read essays. I read the stories of people who had felt things similar to what I was feeling and who had come out the other side. Some of them had realized they were transgender women and had begun to transition. Some of them had realized they were crossdressers who identified as men and simply found comfort and self-expression in clothing traditionally coded as feminine. Some of them had realized they were somewhere in between or somewhere else entirely and had built lives out of that somewhere else. I did not know which of those categories I belonged to. I only knew that finding out that other people existed at all was the first thing that had made me feel less alone since I was 9 years old in front of that closet mirror. I want to pause here and say something to anyone who has ever wondered whether reading other people's stories on the internet is a waste of time, or whether it is somehow indulgent to look for yourself in strangers' words. It is not. Stories are how humans have always understood themselves. Long before the internet, people gathered around fires and around dinner tables and in the back rows of churches and told each other what it had been like to be them, and other people listened and learned that they were not the only ones who had ever felt what they were feeling. That is what community is. That is what it has always been. The internet gave that gift to people like me who could not have found each other otherwise, and I am grateful for it every day, even as I know that the same tools can be used to hurt and mislead. Look for stories that make you feel less alone and more responsible, not stories that make you feel more alone and less accountable. That is the compass I wish someone had given me at 15. I went to college in a city 3 hours from my hometown, and for the first time in my life, I lived somewhere that did not know me. I had a roommate for the first year, a good guy named Marcus who studied engineering and played guitar badly and left his laundry in the dryer for days at a time, and I liked him, and I could not have been more careful around him if he had been a police officer. I did not do anything in that dorm room that I would not have done in front of my grandmother. But in my second year, I got a single room in an older building on the edge of campus, and for the first time in my life, I had a door I could close that no one else had a key to. I remember standing in the middle of that room the first night after my parents had left and feeling a kind of terror that I now recognize as the terror of finally having space to become someone. I did not know who I was going to become. I only knew that I was going to have to find out. I bought my first piece of clothing for myself that fall. It was a plain black skirt from a thrift store 2 neighborhoods away from campus, and I walked past the store 3 times before I went in, and I carried a backpack so that I could put the skirt inside it immediately after buying it, and I paid in cash so that no record would exist. The woman behind the counter did not look at me twice. She had probably sold that same skirt to a dozen people that week. But when I got back to my dorm and locked the door and took the skirt out of the backpack and held it in my hands, I sat on the edge of my bed and cried for 20 minutes. I could not have told you why at the time. I understand now that I was grieving. I was grieving the years I had spent believing I did not deserve to want what I wanted. I was grieving the child who had put back the blue sweater and pretended it had never happened. I was grieving the young man I had almost become, the one who would have kept the drawer locked for the rest of his life and died with the key still in his pocket. I did not become a different person that night. I want to be clear about that, because I think one of the most damaging myths about identity exploration is the idea that there is a single moment of transformation, a lightning strike after which nothing is ever the same. It is not like that. It was not like that for me, and from every honest story I have heard, it is not like that for most people. What happened that night was that I stopped lying to myself about one small thing. That was all. I still went to class the next morning. I still called my mother on Sunday. I still ate cafeteria food with the same 3 friends I had been eating cafeteria food with all semester. But inside, a very slow, very quiet renovation had begun, and it would take years. And there would be days I wanted to tear it all down and start over as someone else, and there would be nights I sat on the floor of that dorm room with my head in my hands wondering whether any of this was worth the fear. The fear deserves its own accounting because I think people who have not lived with a hidden self do not always understand how much of daily life it consumes. I was afraid of being seen. I was afraid of not being seen. I was afraid of my father, who was a good man but who had grown up in a place and a time that had taught him a very narrow definition of what a son should be, and who I loved too much to disappoint. I was afraid of my mother, who I believed would still love me, but whose disappointment would arrive quietly and stay in the room for the rest of our lives. I was afraid of my sister, who had been my closest friend when we were small and who had drifted from me as we grew, in part because I had been hiding from her for so long that she could feel the distance even when she could not name its source. I was afraid of my friends. I was afraid of my professors. I was afraid of the woman at the coffee shop who smiled at me every morning and who I imagined would stop smiling if she knew. Most of all, I was afraid of myself because I had spent so many years treating this part of me as an enemy that I did not know how to sit in a room with it and simply have a conversation. Somewhere in my 3rd year of college, I started seeing a therapist. I want to talk about this openly because I know there is still a stigma attached to therapy, especially for men, and especially for men who grew up in the kind of household where feelings were something you dealt with by going for a long walk and then not mentioning them again. I had resisted the idea for years. I had told myself that therapy was for people who were broken and I did not want to be broken, so I would not go. But the truth was that I was already in pieces. I was just carrying the pieces around in a bag I refused to open. The therapist I found was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Alvarez, who wore soft cardigans and had a stack of books on her desk that included at least 3 I had read myself, and who asked me, in our second session, what I would do if I were not afraid. I remember I could not answer her. I remember I sat there for what felt like a very long time, and finally I said, I do not know, and she said, that is okay, we can start there. We started there. And over the next 2 years, in her small office with a plant in the window that she never remembered to water, I began, for the first time in my life, to say the things out loud that I had only ever said to the inside of my own skull. I told her about the blue sweater. I told her about my sister's closet. I told her about the black skirt. I told her about the nights I had spent hating myself for wanting something I could not even properly name. And she listened and she did not flinch and she did not tell me what I was, and she did not tell me what I should be. What she did instead was harder and more useful. She asked me questions I did not want to answer, and then she waited until I answered them, and then she asked me the next question. She helped me see that the shame I felt was not the same thing as evidence that I was doing something shameful. She helped me see that hiding is a survival strategy, and that survival strategies that keep you alive when you are young can start to suffocate you when you are older. She helped me see that I owed the people in my life honesty, but that I did not owe them a performance of certainty I did not yet possess. One of the most important things she taught me, and I want to pass this along because I think it applies to almost everyone, not just to people exploring their identities, is that self-acceptance is not the same as self-indulgence. Accepting a part of yourself does not mean giving it unlimited authority over your choices. It means acknowledging that it exists, that it has a right to exist, and then making thoughtful decisions about how to live with it in a way that respects both yourself and the people around you. I had spent years thinking that if I ever let this part of me out, it would take over my life. What I learned instead was that when I stopped fighting it, it became quieter. When I stopped treating it as a monster in the basement, it turned out to be a room in the house I had simply never entered. And once I entered it, I found that I could come and go, and that the rest of the house was still mine and still standing. I graduated from college and moved to a smaller city for my first job, a position at a mid-sized company doing work that will not be interesting to describe in detail, but that gave me a steady paycheck and a small apartment of my own. That apartment mattered. It was the first place I had ever lived that was truly, entirely mine. No roommate, no dorm advisor, no landlord who lived downstairs. I furnished it slowly over the course of a year with things I chose because I actually liked them, not because they were what someone like me was supposed to like. I bought a lamp that my father would have called ridiculous. I bought curtains in a color that had no name I could pronounce. And in the back of my closet, on a shelf too high for anyone to see without a stepladder, I kept a small collection of clothes that were mine, that I'd bought for myself, that I wore when I was alone and needed to remember who I was. I want to describe what those evenings were like, not because the clothes themselves are the point, but because I think the emotional texture of them is the point, and I think it matters that people understand what this practice actually looks like for people who do it in the way I did. It was not glamorous. It was not a show. Most of the time I was doing something ordinary, like cooking dinner or reading a book or watching a movie I had already seen 3 times. What was different was the internal weather. When I was dressed in a way that matched what I felt on the inside, the low-grade static that usually accompanied me through the day would go quiet, and I would notice small things I had been too distracted to notice otherwise. The way the light came through the window at 7 in the evening. The taste of the tea I had been drinking absent-mindedly for an hour. The sound of my own breathing when I was not bracing against something. It was not ecstasy. It was peace. And peace, when you have not had it for a long time, is more powerful than ecstasy could ever be. But peace, I learned, is not the same as resolution. There was still the question of what all of this meant. There was still the question of who I was going to be in the world outside my apartment. There was still the question of whether I was a man who liked to wear women's clothing sometimes, or a woman who had not yet found the courage to say so, or something else that neither of those descriptions quite captured. I want to be honest and say that I spent years genuinely not knowing, and that the not knowing was, at times, more painful than any specific answer would have been. Our culture likes tidy categories. It likes stories that end with a clear declaration. But real life is often messier than that, and one of the most important things I have learned is that it is okay to live inside a question for a while. It is okay to say, I do not know yet. It is okay to give yourself the time you need to find out, and to change your mind, and to change it again. Eventually, after a great deal of thought and a great deal of conversation with Dr. Alvarez, and with a small handful of people I had come to trust, I understood that for me, personally, the answer was that I was a man who found real and important self-expression in aspects of femininity that our culture had told me were not mine to touch. I want to be clear that this is my answer, not anyone else's. For other people I have met and read and listened to, the same starting point led to entirely different conclusions. Some realized they were trans women and began to transition, and their lives became fuller and more coherent as a result. Some realized they were non-binary and built lives that lived comfortably outside the categories they had been handed. Some realized what I realized, which is that they were men who happened to have a broader relationship with clothing and self-expression than the culture around them had prepared them for. None of these answers is more correct than the others. Each of them is a person doing the hard work of figuring out who they are and trying to live that answer with integrity. What matters is not which category you land in. What matters is whether you land there honestly, and whether you carry your responsibilities to other people with you when you do. The next chapter of the story is about telling people. I want to spend time on this because I think it is where a lot of stories about identity exploration go wrong, in both directions. On one hand, there are stories that treat coming out as a grand triumphant scene, as if the difficulty is all in the announcement and the aftermath is a montage of hugs. On the other hand, There are stories that treat it as pure catastrophe, as if disclosure inevitably ends in loss. Neither of these was my experience. My experience was that telling people was a long, uneven, sometimes painful, sometimes tender process, and that the people who mattered most did not always react the way I expected, and that in the end I was surprised more often by grace than by cruelty, though there was some of both. The first person I told was my sister. This was not an accident. She and I had drifted, as I said, but she had also been the person I had loved first in this world, and I had come to understand, through my work with Dr. Alvarez, that I owed her a specific apology that I could not deliver, without also telling her the truth about myself. I invited her to dinner at my apartment. I cooked something I actually knew how to cook, which narrowed the options considerably. I waited until we had finished eating and were sitting on my couch with cups of coffee, and I told her that there was something I needed to say and that I needed her to let me get through it before she responded. She nodded, and she waited, and I told her. I told her about the sweater when I was 9. I told her about her closet when we were teenagers. I told her that I was sorry, sincerely and specifically sorry, for the times I had used her clothes without her knowledge, and that I understood now that even though I had never damaged anything, I had still crossed a line that was hers to draw. And then I told her who I was as best as I could describe it at the time, and I stopped talking and I waited. She was quiet for a long time. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I could hear a car passing on the street outside. And then she started to cry, and I started to cry, and she said, "Why did you never tell me?" She said, "I would have let you borrow anything." She said, "I thought you hated me all those years when you were pulling away, and I did not know what I had done." And I understood in that moment, something that I think anyone who has ever hidden from the people they love will eventually have to understand, which is that our hiding hurts them even when they do not know what we are hiding. They feel the wall. They just cannot see it. And they blame themselves for being unable to see through it. My sister had spent our adolescence believing that she had lost me because of something she had done, when in fact she had lost me because of something I could not do, which was be myself in front of her. That is a wound I cannot fully heal. All I can do is not deepen it and stay close to her now, and be honest with her about the rest of my life, and let her know me as I am rather than as a shape she has to guess at. Telling my parents was harder, and I did it in stages, and I did it imperfectly, and I do not want to pretend that it was a clean or a triumphant experience. I told my mother first, on a visit home during a weekend when my father was away at a fishing trip with his brothers. She listened, and she asked careful questions, and she cried some, though less than my sister had. She said she needed time. She said she loved me. She said she was not sure what to do with what I had told her, and that she was going to have to sit with it, and that she did not want me to interpret her silence in the coming weeks as rejection, but rather as thought. And that is what happened. She sat with it. She read some things I sent her. She called me a few weeks later and asked more questions, and then a few weeks after that, more. She did not become an expert on my life overnight, and I did not expect her to. What she did was stay in the conversation, and that is more than a lot of people get, and I have never stopped being grateful for it. My father took longer. My father took years. I want to describe this without bitterness, because I have come to understand that his response was not about me so much as it was about the entire architecture of masculinity he had inherited from his own father, who had inherited it from his, going back generations into a fog of expectation that none of them had ever been given permission to question. My father did not shout. He did not throw me out. He did not tell me I was no longer his son. What he did was become quieter, in a way that felt heavier than shouting would have. He asked me once if I was sure. I said I was as sure as I knew how to be. He nodded. He did not bring it up again for a long time. Our conversations, for a while, were about the weather and the score of the game and whether my car needed new tires. It was not what I had wanted. It was not what I had hoped for, but it was not the ending I had feared, either, and I learned to hold that middle space with as much patience as I could gather. Then, one afternoon about 2 years after I had told him, he called me. He did not usually call. He usually let my mother call and pass the phone to say a few sentences and hand it back. But this time he called, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said that he had been thinking, and that he had spent a lot of his life being told what a man was supposed to be, and that some of the things he had been told had not turned out to be true, and that he loved me and he did not fully understand me, but he wanted to, and that he was sorry it had taken him so long to say so. I do not think I have ever cried harder in my life than I did after that phone call. I want anyone listening to hear this and understand that people can surprise you. Not always. Not everyone. But sometimes the person you are most afraid of losing is the person who, given enough time and the right kind of quiet, will find their way to you. It is not guaranteed. But it is possible, and possibility is worth waiting for when the alternative is closing the door forever. I want to talk now about the mistakes I have made in this journey, because a story that only lists its triumphs is not a story worth telling. I have hurt people. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but through the ordinary friction of being a person who was hiding for too long and who did not always know how to stop. I mentioned my sister already. There was also a woman I dated in my late 20s, whose name I will not use, who deserved a more honest partner than I was capable of being at the time. I did not tell her about this part of myself for the first several months of our relationship, and by the time I did, she had already invested more in me than I had allowed her to make an informed decision about. She was gracious. She was more gracious than I deserved. She thanked me for telling her, and she said she needed time to think, and after some time she told me that she cared about me but that she did not feel she could build the future she wanted on a foundation that had started with an omission. She was right. I did not argue. I have thought about her many times since, not with romantic longing but with a kind of respectful ache, and I have tried, in every relationship since, to be honest earlier rather than later, because I learned from her that withheld truth is its own form of unkindness, even when it is dressed up as protection. I have also made mistakes in the direction of overcorrection. There was a period in my early 30s when, having finally begun to accept myself, I became almost evangelical about it in a way that I now recognize as more about my own unresolved feelings than about anyone else's needs. I brought it up in conversations where it was not relevant. I judged people who I felt were not accepting enough, or fast enough, or in the exact ways I wanted them to be. I mistook other people's discomfort for other people's cruelty, and I sometimes wrote people off who might, given a little more time and a little more patience from me, have grown alongside me. I have tried to make amends where I can. I have tried, at least, to notice the pattern in myself and to catch it before it takes over conversation. Growth is not linear, and it is not only about how you treat yourself. It is also about how you treat the people who are trying imperfectly to keep up. There is one more mistake I want to name because I think it is one that people in any kind of identity exploration are vulnerable to, and I wish someone had warned me about it. For a while, I let this part of my identity become the whole of my identity. I read about it constantly. I thought about it constantly. I measured every interaction I had by whether it had gone well through the lens of this one aspect of who I was. And what I discovered after a long time was that I had traded one kind of narrow life for another. I had spent my youth being defined by the absence of this part of me, and now I was in danger of being defined only by its presence. Neither was accurate. I am a person who cares about my family, who loves reading history books that no one else in my life wants to talk about, who volunteers at a food pantry on Saturday mornings, who has strong opinions about how to make a decent loaf of bread, who's trying to be a good friend to the friends I have, and a decent citizen of the small community I live in. This part of my identity is real and important, but it is one instrument in an orchestra, not the whole song. Learning that took me longer than it should have, and I offer it to anyone listening who might be in the middle of the same lesson. Now I want to talk about the present and about what my life actually looks like. I am in my late 30s. I live in the same city where I got my first job, in a slightly larger apartment now with a small garden on the balcony that I mostly succeed at keeping alive. I have a partner, a person I love who knows every part of me and who I knew every part of before we decided to build something together, because I learned my lesson from the mistake I described earlier. Our relationship is not without its difficulties, because no honest relationship is, but it is built on ground that does not shift underneath us, and that steadiness is something I did not know how to imagine when I was younger. I see my parents regularly. My father and I have taken up a strange, tentative habit of going fishing together once or twice a year, and we do not talk about identity or feelings while we are out on the water, but we talk, and the talking itself is a kind of answer that I did not know I was waiting for. My sister is one of my closest friends again, and her children call me by a name I love, and I have never taken any of it for granted. The clothes are still part of my life, but they are not the center of it. Some days I wear things that our culture has coded as masculine, and I feel like myself. Some days I wear things that our culture has coded as feminine, and I feel like myself. The difference now, compared to when I was younger, is that the feeling of being myself is not tied to any particular outfit. I have done enough interior work that the self I am reaching for is available to me most of the time, regardless of what I am wearing. The clothes are one of many ways I express what is already there. They are not the source. The source is inside, and it always was, and I spent decades looking outside for something that had been waiting for me all along. I want to end by offering a few reflections that I hope are useful to anyone listening, whether or not any part of my story resembles your own. The first is that identity is not a puzzle you solve once. It is a garden you tend. It grows. It changes. It surprises you. The version of yourself you were at 20 is not the version you will be at 40, and if it is, something has probably gone wrong because human beings are meant to keep becoming. The second is that hiding is expensive. It costs you sleep, and it costs you closeness, and it costs the people around you the truth of your presence. There are seasons when hiding is genuinely necessary for survival, and I would never tell someone to come out before it is safe to do so. But if you are hiding out of habit, or out of a fear that has outlived its usefulness, I hope you will consider, gently and on your own timeline, whether there is one small piece of yourself you could stop hiding this week. Not everything. Just one small piece. See what happens. See if the world ends. It probably will not. The third reflection is about responsibility. Self-acceptance is not a license to hurt other people, and it is not a license to stop caring about how your choices affect the people who love you. The people in my life deserved honesty from me, and when I did not give it to them, I caused harm, even when I was also trying to protect myself. If you are exploring who you are, please try to bring the people who matter to you along as much as you safely can. Not all at once. Not all the details. But do not build a version of yourself in secret that you then unveil to them as a stranger. Let them see the process. Let them ask questions. Let them be part of your becoming. It is harder in the short term, and it is much better in the long term, for you and for them. The fourth reflection is about empathy in the other direction. If you are someone who loves a person who is exploring their identity in any direction, please try to remember that their journey is not about you, even when their choices affect you. They're not doing this to hurt you. They are not doing this because they did not love the person you thought they were. They are doing this because there is a truer version of themselves that has been waiting a long time to breathe, and you have the extraordinary privilege of being one of the people they trust enough to breathe in front of. Try to receive that gift, even when it is confusing, even when you need time. Say, I love you, and I need time in the same sentence and mean both halves, and give yourself the same grace you would want them to give you. The fifth reflection, and maybe the most important one, is about the difference between shame and accountability. Shame says you are bad. Accountability says you did something you can do differently next time. Shame closes you off from other people. Accountability opens you to them. Shame is loud and paralyzing. Accountability is quiet and useful. I spent so much of my life confusing the two and letting shame masquerade as accountability and using the constant hum of shame as evidence that I was a bad person rather than as evidence that I was carrying something too heavy alone. If you are carrying shame right now, please consider whether what you are actually holding is a bill that accountability could pay off if you are willing to let someone help you look at it. The sixth reflection is about hope, and I want to be careful with this one because I do not want to promise anyone anything I cannot promise. I cannot promise you that your family will come around. I cannot promise you that your community will accept you. I cannot promise you that the world will be kind. But I can promise you that there are more people like you than you think, and that some of them are actively looking for you the way you are looking for them, and that finding each other is one of the great quiet miracles that keeps this world livable. Look for those people. Be one of those people for someone else when you can. Build small circles of honesty and expand them slowly. That is how communities have always been built, and it is how they will keep being built long after all of us are gone. The last thing I want to say before I close is that I am not a spokesperson for anyone but myself. Nothing I have said in this story is meant to describe what any other person's experience is or should be. If you have felt any of the things I described, that does not mean you are what I am, and it does not mean you are anything specific at all. It means you are a human being with an interior life, and that interior life deserves your attention and your patience and your willingness to sit with it long enough to hear what it is trying to tell you. Do not rush to a conclusion. Do not force yourself into a category because a category feels safer than a question. Live inside the question until the question becomes an answer on its own, and then live inside that answer with humility because it might change, and if it changes, that is not a failure. That is just being alive. I have told this story today because I wish someone had told me a story like it when I was younger. Not a story of drama or transformation or spectacle, but a story of a person, ordinary in most ways, who spent a long time being afraid of a small, quiet part of himself, and who eventually learned to sit with that part without fear, and who found that sitting with it made the rest of his life more possible, not less. If any of this has been useful to you, I am glad. If none of it has been, I hope you found in it at least the reassurance that people are complicated and are trying, and that trying is enough on the days when winning is out of reach. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.